He arrived in Beijing with all the ceremonial trimmings, the red carpet, the welcome ceremony, the carefully staged photographs, and yet it was a small, almost invisible detail that whispered the real story behind the summit. The aides did not carry their own phones. Laptops were left behind. Personal devices that in ordinary life keep diplomats, journalists, and business leaders tethered to the world were absent from pockets and briefcases. In their place, stripped-down handsets, temporary devices, specially prepared communication kits, and tightly managed networks designed to keep conversations private and keep foreign eyes away. That image, powerful people traveling like shadow diplomats, dependent on paper, on face-to-face meetings, on systems that move deliberately rather than instantly, captures the new reality of high-stakes diplomacy between Washington and Beijing. This was not just a state visit. It was a study in how mistrust has reshaped the mechanics of government to gov. Ernment conversation, technology, once a tool of convenience, has become itself a terrain of competition and caution. The summit convened at a fraught moment. Leaders talked about trade and semiconductors, about artificial intelligence and supply chains. They negotiated over Taiwan, a topic Beijing describes as a fundamental core interest. They discussed the spiraling crisis in the Middle East and the clear and present risks to shipping through the Strait of Hormuz. Underneath those public priorities, the delegation room hummed with a private understanding. Information matters, and the means by which it travels matters even more. Inside the American security establishment, travel to China has long been treated differently from ordinary overseas trips. Officials are advised to assume any device crossing the border could be observed. That assumption shapes everything from meeting schedules to what is written down and what is only said in person. When officials land in Beijing, ordinary D. Digital life gives way to rigid procedures, messages routed through hardened channels, delays introduced by layers of review, and in some cases, sensitive conversations delivered face to face. The effect is paradoxical. The fastest, most network leaders in the world are temporarily forced to operate in an older, quieter diplomacy, a place where every sentence is chosen, every email is withheld, and every handshake is, in a way, a secure transmission. Those precautions have a reason. Years of allegations and counterclaims about cyber activity and intelligence collection. American officials point to a pattern of suspected operations that targeted government networks, private companies, research institutions, and critical infrastructure. Beijing has consistently rejected those accusations, insisting that its laws protect privacy and national sovereignty and denials state involvement in unlawful surveillance. The denials, though, have not erased the skepticism that underpins the relation. The ship. Instead, distrust has extended its reach from trade tariffs to the microchips that power artificial intelligence, from academic exchanges to the very cables and radios that carry official messages. Against that backdrop, the public choreography of the summit, leaders greeting one another at the Great Hall of the People, toasts, joint statements, played out as carefully as the security protocols behind closed doors. Beijing's message, repeated through speeches and official statements, emphasized stability and dialogue. If the two countries do not engage, it will only lead to misunderstandings and misjudgments, heading toward conflict and confrontation, and will even jeopardize the world, Chinese officials warned. That language reflected a familiar refrain from Beijing: major powers must manage disputes, not magnify them. At the same time, China made clear its red lines. Taiwan was described not as one issue among many, but as the core of China's core interest, a phrase that Xi carries real diplomatic weight. Officials in Beijing warned foreign governments against supporting moves toward independence and repeatedly invoked the One China principle as the political foundation of their relations. For Chinese leaders, anything that appears to encourage secession is more than a diplomatic misstep. It is a provocation that can unsettle a delicate balance in the region. The United States, for its part, has been signaling multiple priorities at once. Washington seeks to stabilize economic ties, protect semiconductor supply lines, and shape how emerging technologies like artificial intelligence are governed. It also remains concerned about freedom of navigation, the security of partners in the Indo-Pacific, and the safety of maritime routes that carry a substantial share of the world's energy supplies. The Strait of Hormuz, in particular, was one of those immediate worries. Chinese officials criticized certain U.S. military moves in the region as escalatory. This is a dangerous and irresponsible act. One statement read, reflecting Beijing's alarm at stepped-up deployments and blockades that, in its view, risked inflaming a tenuous ceasefire. The summit, therefore, unfolded on three, sometimes contradictory levels. There was the ritual, visits to cultural sites, banquets, and staged statements of cooperation. There were the negotiations, talks on trade, tariffs, licenses, and the rules that might govern semiconductors and AI access. And there was the silent, high-stakes bookkeeping of trust. Who could be trusted with a document, with a conversation, with a line of code? That invisible ledger matters because modern conflict and competition are increasingly fought not just in the skies and on the seas, but in servers and on networks. Cybersecurity concerns shape bureaucratic behavior. Where once ambassadors might have relied on secure state messaging platforms and trusted lines, the fear of compromise now pushes more things into physical meetings. It makes diplomacy slower and, paradoxically, more personal. Sensitive details are passed in private rooms. Negotiators revise drafts slowly and deliberately. A handshake in that context can be laden with more meaning than a signed communiqué. The dynamic reaches beyond governments. Corporations, academic institutions, and ordinary travelers feel the reverberations. Business executives who travel with delegations are vetted and travel on controlled itineraries. Researchers and students face new scrutiny. Supply chains are reassessed through the lens of risk. The tech industry, which stands at the center of both nations' ambitions, finds itself bargaining for access while also navigating export controls, licensing regimes, and national security reviews. Beijing's diplomatic framing during the summit emphasized mutual respect and the language of coexistence. One official statement put it this way: the primary objective here is to consistently uphold a sincere attitude of mutual respect. Firmly maintain the fundamental bottom line of peaceful coexistence and actively strive for the promising prospect of mutually beneficial win-win cooperation. Those words are aspirational. They also serve a political purpose to reassure domestic audiences and the international community that China prefers negotiation over confrontation, but the rhetoric sits alongside real strategic rivalry. Beijing has criticized what it calls excessive U.S. military activity in sensitive waterways and faulted American security assessments it sees as biased. Washington, meanwhile, continues to press China on issues ranging from human rights to technology transfers and the treatment of Chinese citizens abroad. Officials in Beijing have complained about what they describe as heavy-handed enforcement that targets Chinese business people and citizens in the United States, arguing that prolonged interrogations, detentions, and deportations damage trust and chill people-to-people exchanges. Those complaints highlight how competition now affects not just policy, but everyday lives on both sides. There are practical policy questions at the summit that will reverberate for years. How will the two governments manage AI cooperation and competition? Can they carve out rules for shared access to research, or at least boundaries that reduce the chance of unintended escalation? What will happen with semiconductor exports and the steps countries take to protect sensitive chip manufacturing? And how will they address the immediate crisis in the Middle East, where disruptions in shipping and regional instability threaten global markets? Economics cannot be divorced from strategy. The United States and China are each other's major trading partners, even as they vie for influence, That interdependence complicates the calculus. Decoupling is costly, but so too is unfettered access to technologies that could provide strategic advantage. The summit was a live demonstration of that tension. Business discussions were front and center. CEOs and corporate delegations arrived with a dual mission: to press for market access and to assure regulators and governments that commercial ties can be managed responsibly. Yet the symbolism of leaders gathered in Beijing and the images of aides traveling without personal devices suggests another truth. Trust is not something that can be signed into existence with a single agreement or photo op. It is a daily incremental product of behavior verification and shared norms. When every phone may be a liability, when secure communication depends on special arrangements, that lack of trust becomes a form of policy in itself. It changes timelines and expectations. It makes states plan for contingencies and design diplomacy for adversity rather than ease. For journalists and observers, the summit is an exercise in reading gestures as much as words. A joint statement that praises cooperation on trade may be paired with separate national security plan. It's that hardened defenses. Leaders can publicly emphasize dialogue and privately take steps to protect technological advantage. That duality is part of how major powers manage rivalry while avoiding direct conflict. Engagement without trust has become a shorthand for this balancing act. Two countries that must talk to each other because the alternativeness calculation, economic shock, or military escalation is worse than any short-term concession. What this means for the global order is complex. On the one hand, symmetry keeps channels open. High-level meetings provide opportunities to diffuse crises, coordinate on shared challenges like climate and pandemics, and set expectations for conduct. On the other hand, the shifting terrain of technology and intelligence makes missteps more likely. A misinterpreted cyber incident or a leaked conversation could rapidly inflame tensions in ways that are hard to predict and harder to contain. The faces at the banquet table, the cameras flashing outside the meeting room, and the diplomatic language of cooperation are all part of the performance of statecraft. But behind the scenes, the smallest choices, who carries which device, which network is allowed, which message is delivered in person, matter enormously. They are the procedural architecture that either enables trust to take root or makes it harder to grow. For students of international relations, the summit is a classroom in the modern anatomy of power. It shows a world where technology is both a tool and a vulnerability, where commerce and competition are braided together, and where diplomacy must adapt to the realities of an information age that can be weaponized as easily as it can be used to connect people. The leaders on the stage are negotiating not just policy, but posture, how to reassure allies, how to manage domestic audiences, and how to demonstrate resolve without tipping into confrontation. There are no simple outcomes. A single summit will not resolve deaths of strategic rivalry or erase mutual suspicions that governments have cultivated over years. But these meetings can set boundaries and buy time. They can establish protocols for crisis communication and clarify red lines, even as both sides continue to hedge and prepare for long-term competition. In the end, the most enduring image from this visit may not be a handshake or a joint declaration. It may be the sight of senior officials at the center of global power, traveling with temporary phones and carefully controlled networks, a small, stark reminder that in an era of digital vulnerability, even diplomacy must be engineered with care. If the conversations in the closed rooms lead to better coordination on the Iran crisis, clearer understandings on Taiwan, and responsible rules for emerging technologies, the summit will have done important work. If instead the technologies remain battlegrounds and mistrust deepens, then those temporary phones will stand as a symbol of a larger, fracturing engagement without the foundation of mutual confidence. For now, the leaders have talked. They have posed for photographs, offered carefully worded appeals for stability, and reiterated the claim that cooperation remains possible even amid serious disagreement. We cannot change one another, but we can change the way we interact, a Chinese official said, reflecting a diplomatic posture that mixes assertion with an invitation to manage differences. Whether those words turn into sustained practice will depend as much on what happens in back offices and secure rooms as on what appears on the evening news. Diplomacy has always been part choreography, part negotiation, part trust building. What is new is how much of that work now depends on the security of a simple device and the integrity of the pathways that carry a message. In that sense, the summit was less a break with the past than an adaptation, an acknowledgement that the instruments of power have evolved and that state, must reinvent how they talk to one another when every byte of information can also be a vulnerability. The leaders parted with a mixture of public civility and private caution. The agreements and the declarations will be parsed for months. The legacy of the trip will be measured not only in signed paperwork, but in whether either side altered the architecture of mistrust or simply learned anew how to work around it. In the meantime, the world watched as two of its most powerful nations negotiated amid the hum of secure networks and the quiet discipline of devices switched off and replaced for the sake of prudence. That is the staying image of modern diplomacy: power, ritual, commerce, and the slow, careful engineering of communication, all shaped by the simple, consequential act of what we choose to carry in our pockets.